4020.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to one of the most eagerly awaited literary events for a very long time, but particularly in rugby. And in many respects, it's a perfect storm. You've got Professor Tony Collins, who to everyone in the room needs no introduction. 4-time winner of the Lord Aberdare Prize, soon to be 5, with a book about Roy Francis.
Don't count your chicken.
I'm counting your chicken. The best writer about the best subject. I know everybody in here, particularly from a Leeds perspective, will know Roy and the contribution he made, but I think it's worth just reading the inside jacket as to what the book's about, because it's more than you'll think. So in the 1950s and 60s, one man dominated rugby coaching like no other. He led teams to championships and Wembley finals, revolutionised the art of coaching, and inspired his players to incredible achievements. But even more amazingly, for those times, he was a black man in a white world. As the illegitimate child of a mixed-race couple who gave him up for adoption, his story recounts his upbringing in a black family living in the Welsh coalfields, a childhood shaped by memories of the 1919 Welsh race riots, and foremost, his gift for rugby. Aged just 17, Roy left home to play professionally for Wigan, and despite facing racism, in 1947 became the first black player to play for Great Britain in either rugby code. Roy became whole Rugby League club coach in 1951, where he introduced video analysis, sports psychology and personalised training, revolutionary methods which turned a mediocre team into championship winners. His crowning glory came when his Leeds team triumphed in the famous 1968 water splash Wembley Cup final, and he headed down under in 1969 to become North Sydney Bears coach. Through archives, family members' accounts and former players' memories, Roy tells the story of a family's journey from slavery to sporting success, and of a remarkable man who defied prejudice to reach the pinnacle of rugby as a player, coach and leader. So that's what we're going to talk about tonight. I just wanted to make particular welcome of 3 people in the room. We're going to hear later from Ian, Roy's son, sat there. But the 3 people played under Roy and all played here at Leeds. So just a very warm welcome to Alan Smith, Barry Seaborn and Drew Broach. Before I get chastised for it, Phil Holmes also played for him. It was one game, he scored 2 tries, it'll never be beaten in the history of the club. And Phil would like me to tell you that as often as possible. So I'm going to start by trying to put some context to what was there. The book's subtitle is Rugby's Forgotten Black Leader. Why has Roy's place in coaching history been at best ignored? Is it just simply a question of race?
A great question to start off with. No, it's not. I think in a lot of instances, he's not been forgotten. In Hull and in Leeds, within the rugby league community, then Roy Francis is still a name that people recognise. But I do think that in terms of what his achievements are, and I think this is one of the points about the book, in the 1950s, when there was only a small black community across Britain, that here was a guy who had grown up in a very small black community in South Wales, and basically became the leader of teams of predominantly white players in the 1950s and 1960s, when things were very different from what they are today. And it's that kind of achievement, I think, that's really been forgotten about. And I think that you've also got the issue, and I'm sure people are thinking, well, he would say that, wouldn't he? The rugby league itself is forgotten about, as the recent story about the lack of rugby league knighthoods demonstrates, which, I mean, personally, I'm not a supporter of the honour system, but nevertheless, it demonstrates the way in which rugby league is generally forgotten about, and the achievements that people make in rugby league, the things that are achieved by the players, coaches, administrators, supporters. Those things are generally not acknowledged in the same way they would be if they were carried out in other sports. So I think that within Rugby League, Roy's not been forgotten. I think perhaps he thought he'd been forgotten in the 1980s, but I don't think he was. But yeah, I think it's Roy being forgotten is as much about Rugby League's place in the world as what it is about anybody's memory.
So just sort of following on from that, where does he rank as the father of modern coaching? It's a phrase that's used a lot. It's an accolade that's given to the likes of Carwyn James or in Rugby League, Jack Gibson. How far ahead of his time was Roy?
Well, I think when you look at the systems that he put in place and the techniques that he brought to the sport, everybody I spoke to a lot of players when I was doing both. So there's a lot of interviews from players who all say he was years ahead of his time, he's decades ahead of his time. That's also true in Australia as well. When you speak to North Sydney players and listen to their reminiscences, they also say, even in Australia, Roy was decades ahead of his time. And I think that was because there's two aspects to it. One, there was the things that I think many people here will know, that he introduced video analysis when he was at home. So he bought a cine camera and filmed matches and training sessions and used it in the same way that coaches do today to say, you should have been stood here. This is what the opposition are going to do. We need to stand in this way. Or all the usual things that are done today, taken for granted in video analysis. Roy was doing in the 1950s. He also was very innovative in the way that he brought scientific training methods to the team. So he brought in professional sprint coaches, made sure every player had a pair of spikes, running shoes, so they could train with, and that led to, he insisted on that for everybody. So he brought in a whole series of things that today we take for granted. There was also the whole aspect of he treated players with respect. He felt that the way to get the best out of players was to be respectful, and you would get respect back, because the way to motivate players was by boosting their self-confidence. And again, a lot of players have said this to me. One of the great things about Roy was that he didn't rule by fear. He didn't think that people would perform better when they were frightened of getting stripped on off at the half-time or anything. He thought the way to get the best out of players was to treat them as well as he could and boost their self-confidence, and then they could let their talents and skills flower on the pitch, and that succeeded. So there are all the kind of elements that we take for granted today. There's a couple of other things as well. So when Roy was in the army during World War II, he trained as a PT instructor and became a PT instructor. And I went back, when I was writing the book, I went back to the National Archives and looked at some of the training manuals that were distributed to PT instructors during the war. And they're really like training manuals that you get today. So they would have particular training regimes for particular types of soldiers. So if you're in the infantry, or if you're in commandos, or in the Air Force or on ships, each one had a bespoke training course. They also place psychology at the centre of it as well. So Roy took that in a way that nobody else, as far as I'm aware, did in rugby. In football, you get managers like Matt Busby at Man United, Joe Mercer at Man City, who are also PT instructors. It's no accident that they became leading managers in the 50s and 60s. So Roy had that background. The other thing, though, that I think really seals the deal to him being the father of modern coaching is the fact that he made the team his. So in the 1950s, and this was true of soccer as well as rugby league, teams were selected by committees. The football committee or the selection committee would watch training every week, and they'd pick the team. And it was the manager's job, basically, just to make sure the players were fit. When Roy took over at Hull in 1951, he insisted he had control of the team. And the board didn't really like it, but they accepted it. And so there was a compromise made whereby Roy would pick the team, but he'd have to write it down and take it to the board every Thursday night at the board meeting, and the board would rubber stamp it. And that was a tremendous step forward, because Even great players who became coaches in the 1950s, like Jim Sullivan at Wigan and then at St Helens, never had control over the team. So Roy established that principle. One of the interesting things that Johnny Whiteley told me is that when Roy was down from Hull to come here in 1963, Johnny Whiteley took over his position as coach of Hull. And at the first meeting that Johnny had with the board, they said, "You're not selecting the team." So Roy had established this principle, and then as soon as he'd gone, the whole board took it away from the next coaches. And I don't think it's really until the late 70s and Arthur Bunting that the coach truly picked the team at Hull, and probably the same at other clubs. So Roy had total control. The players were... he was the mentor. He was the father figure to the players, and he cultivated that relationship. And I think that's what makes him different from every other coach. Most other coaches in rugby at that time, and in rugby union, they didn't even have coaches at that time. It was illegal to have coaches because that was seen as professionalism, and professionalism wasn't allowed. So Roy really established the template of the coach or the manager who's in control of the team, selects the team, decides the tactics, and has that individual relationship with the players. That really didn't exist before any time. And so that's why I think that more than anybody else, you can really say he is the father of modern coaching.
Nobody in this room will be surprised that the book, which is on sale at the back, is meticulously researched. I'm guessing that probably the area that fascinated you the most was finding out about Roy's birth father.
Partly, but to be honest with you, the thing that fascinated me most was the fact that Roy Francis was part of the world that I grew up in the 60s and 70s, and he was part of the world that my parents and grandparents were part of. So there's in the book I've tried to describe each of the places where he was, and so obviously writing about Hull, the town that I grew up in, taught me a bit about the town and about how it related, its relationship with rugby and sport. And same with Leeds, which is the town I've lived in for the last, the city I've lived in for the last 30 years. That taught me, writing that taught me about it. So it's kind of, in a sense, it's a voyage of self-discovery. I'm part of the community that Roy was part of, as we all are. And writing about Roy was really writing about who I am and my community. But you're absolutely right. When I started writing the book, I thought this is a really fascinating story because he's the father of modern coaching, and I can investigate that. And also, it's very strange and very enlightened, the fact that it's the 1950s, and here's a black guy in charge of white players, predominantly white players. Had some black players at the end of his regime in Hull, at Hull, and then here as well. But this was probably unique in British society at that time. I don't think there's any other example in the 1950s where a black man was in charge of white men. I might be wrong, but I think you'd have to look very hard about that to find that out. Which I think says something about Roy and his character and his charisma and his leadership skills. But I think it also tells you something about Rugby League as well, the fact that he was in Rugby League where this happened. But to go back finally to the point you're raising about Roy's father. So I thought this was going to be a book that's a fascinating story about rugby. But obviously, when you're writing a biography, you have to find out where people come from. What are their families like? What are their backgrounds like? And I discovered quite early on that Roy's parentage was a bit of a mystery because his birth certificate is incorrect. The father's name on it isn't quite right. The address of his mother isn't right. And there's some other details that just don't match up. Anyway, so told me to members of Roy's family and doing research on websites like Ancestry.com and Find My Past. There are other ones available, of course. I kind of managed to piece together the story that Roy's father was a man called Lionel Francis. And Lionel Francis came to South Wales from Trinidad sometime in the late 1890s. And he became a miner. And interestingly enough, he wasn't the only black miner in South Wales then. There were at least 50 or 60 black miners in the Welsh coalfields, which I think, again, is an interesting point. That's where, that kind of shows you how racially mixed things have been for a long time. But, so Lionel Francis becomes a miner. So in 1906, he marries a woman called Rebecca, who also comes from a black family in Brynmawr in South Wales, where Roy was born. It's a volatile relationship, and Lionel clearly plays away from home, for want of a better term. And in 1919, a young white woman in Brynmawr gives birth to baby Roy. It's Lionel's baby. But pretty soon after baby Roy's born, Roy is adopted by Lionel's wife and brought up as part of her family. And she was always known by Roy and the family as Roy's mum and as the kids' grandma, which I think is a great example of proving that love is thicker than either blood or water when it comes to families. And so Lionel being Lionel, runs away to America in 1920, 18 months after Roy's born, where he reinvents himself as Dr. Lionel Francis, who was educated at Edinburgh University Medical School and then in Paris at Sorbonne. And he becomes a leader of an organisation called the United Negro Improvement Association, which is like basically a civil rights organisation in America that has a massive membership of over 100,000 people in the 1920s. It's led by a guy called Marcus Garvey, who's then was certainly the most famous black politician in the world, kind of like sort of known in the same way that other politics are different, known in the same way as Martin Luther King is. If you had to name a black politician in the 1920s, 1930s, you would say Marcus Garvey, unless you knew a lot about politics. Lionel becomes a leading member of this organisation, then falls out with Marcus Garvey, and eventually replaces Marcus Garvey as the president of the association. So you have this, and I thought this is absolutely mind-boggling. It doesn't even seem that it's something that is believable. That here we are, in 1919, it's a bloke having, who's had an illegitimate son with his mistress, who's then adopted by his wife. Then all of a sudden, 10 years later, he's leading the biggest black civil rights organisation in America. And for a long time, I thought, I wonder if this is actually right. Have I got it wrong? Have I made a mistake somewhere? But no, it all checks out. It's a true story. It's an amazing story. The other thing I'll say about Lionel Francis, well, two other things. One, he eventually went to Belize, where he ran an estate in Belize, which had been given to the United Negro Association by one of the millionaires in Belize. The other thing about Lionel, you would have heard earlier on, we were playing some jazz dance music from the 1930s by Snake Hips Johnson and his All-Stars. Lionel had another illegitimate son in 1901 with the wife of a workmate who he was lodging with. And that boy, was called Arthur Dibbin, who you probably haven't heard of unless you're a really, really big fan of jazz in the 1930s, who was the vocalist and the trumpet player with Snake Hips Johnson's band in the 1930s. So it's quite possible that the track I was playing earlier on, Arthur Dibbin may have been playing trumpet on it. So it kind of, it's like all these circles that go round and meet up. So it's an incredible story. So yeah, it's sort of, for me, it was as much a voyage of discovery as it was a kind of, a writing project.
There's a number of contentious incidents in Roy's early life. As a rugby player, he'd been sold by Wigan soon after arriving there, wasn't selected for the 1946 Great Britain tour when a lot of people said nailed on. Racism was hinted at as the reason behind both of those decisions. Does the book confirm or deny those allegations? Spoiler alert if you're going to buy the book.
It's slightly more complicated than that, because to deal with the Wigan situation first, I think that Roy joined Wigan when he was 17 in 1936, straight from Bryn Mawr. He only ever played 4 matches of senior rugby union for Bryn Mawr Rugby Union Club before Wigan snapped him up. And so he was basically a player who was being developed. He played in the A-team, had a great career in the A-team, played 3 or 4 matches in the first team for the first couple of seasons. Then in 1938-1939 season, he started to play more regularly. Just as he was doing that, Wigan appointed a new manager, Harry Sunderland, who I'm sure you will have heard of. Harry Sunderland was a very controversial figure for a whole range of reasons. He was both a journalist and a manager. So while he was manager of Wigan, he was also writing a column for the Manchester Evening News and the Brisbane Telegraph. So it's a bit like, it's like Gary writing columns all over the place while he's still trying to run Leeds. There's a kind of conflict of interest then, because you've got the inside scoop on everything. So Harry Sunderland took over Wigan, and within a matter of weeks, Roy was on the transfer list. And then he was sold to Barrow in January 1936, literally days before I turned 20. Which Wigan supporters wrote to the Wigan Evening paper saying, "What are you doing selling Roy Francis? Our 3/4 line's ageing. They're all going to be 30 at the end of the season. But we sold, one of the brightest prospects we've had for a decade." Barrow fans said, "This is amazing. Why have Wigan sold them? What's going on here?" So there was suspicions. Roy always thought he'd been sold because Harry Sunderland didn't like the colour of his skin. And I think there's no smoking gun. And, we're 80 odd years after this, so you can't say for certain. But it is the case that Harry Sunderland had some unsavoury views about things. So he thought Hitler was a great German, for example. I say there's no smoking gun, but I think circumstantial evidence would suggest that it was something to do with the colour of Roy's skin. The 1946 tour, that's even more complicated, because when the team was selected in January 1946 to tour down under for the first tour after the end of the war, Roy had only just returned to play for Barrow. He'd actually been badly injured in the season before. In 1944, in the summer of 44, he'd gone to Teesside to help train lorry drivers who were involved in the D-Day landings, and he broke a leg, and so he didn't play any rugby for that whole season. And then when he was getting demobbed from the army in 45 after the war ended, that took a bit of time, so he didn't really get back into the Barrow team really in time to come into selection. And that season he didn't finish in the top 20 try scorers, and we did the following seasons. The other thing that was going on is that going back to selection committees, the Lions were chosen by a selection committee, and a lot of horse trading used to go on. And Barrow on that tour had already had 3 players selected, including Jim Luthwaite, who was also a pretty good winger. And so Roy wasn't selected. And I don't think, on the evidence that you can see when you look at what was going on in the game and Roy's form compared to the other 3/4 form who were selected, I don't think that he wasn't selected for that tour because of the colour of his skin. However, Roy did think that he hadn't been selected for the Lions because of the colour of his skin, and I think he was referring to something else, which really has been forgotten by the game, which is the fact that until 1954, no black player was ever selected to play for Great Britain against Australia. And that came to light when I was looking at trying to trace back and see what happened in 1936. In 1936, Wigan had a great standoff. George Bennett, who was another black guy from Wales, and he was clearly, reading reports of the best standoff in Britain at the time. But he wasn't selected for the Lions tour. Only one standoff was selected, and there was no backup standoff. They had Stan Brogdon, who was a winger, as a backup standoff. Not a word was said in Britain about why George Bennett hadn't been selected, but in Australia and New Zealand there was a lot of comment. And they all said the reason why George Bennett hasn't been selected is because the selectors won't select a black player to play for Great Britain against Australia. And the Australians, remember, Australia didn't have anything to brag about because at that point it had a white Australia policy. But the Australian Rugby League press said, "Oh no, we want him to come. We've got no objections. We've got a white Australia policy, but that's only for people who want to live here. If you want to visit, then that's fine." And also they had the West Indian cricket team that toured a couple of years before that. And so it's quite. And then the confirmation of this came in when the Kangaroos came over in 37, when Harry Beverley, who was a starting loose forward, was injured for one of the matches, and there was a big speculation about who's going to replace him. And the obvious candidate was Alec Gibbons, who was another Black Welsh player, who was a loose forward for Oldham, at least played for Huddersfield. And George Thompson, who was a rugby league reporter for the Bradford Telegraph, let the cat out of the bag and said it's quite well known that there are many selectors who won't select a black player to play against Australia. And I think that's what Roy was talking about when he said in 46 he wasn't picked because of the colour of his skin. Even if he had been fit, fully fit at the beginning of the season, even if he had been in the top 20 try scorers, even if he had have returned to his form that he showed before and during the war, he probably wouldn't have been picked. And I think that's what he was talking about. That only changed in 1954 when Billy Boston was picked to go on tour to Australia. Before that, in 51, Seth Thompson was selected to play for Great Britain against New Zealand. So things did change, but sadly, Roy never got to tour. He did play for Great Britain against New Zealand in one of the great Test matches in 47. He scored 2 tries in his debut. So it's a complicated story, and there are elements of that story of which the game should not be proud.
He had a cameo appearance at Warrington where he was also successful, but how much of a risk do you think Hull took? Not necessarily in bringing him in as a player towards the end of his career, but player coach and then coach. You talked about how he obviously changed the selection role, but I mean, Hull were a middling team at best. Was this a brave selection, do you think?
It was brave in one sense because he hadn't coached before, but on the other hand, I think Hull knew what they were doing. Hull had got a new board the season before they signed Roy, and the chairman was well called Ernie Hardacre, who was the brother, if any remember Alan Hardacre, who used to be the secretary of the Football Association. Ernie Hardacre was Alan Hardacre's brother. And Ernie was quite a smart guy, and I think that Roy's reputation went before him, and they recruited him because they knew they wanted him to be coach. Hull didn't have a coach at that time. For 3 years before Roy took over, they didn't actually have a coach. They had a trainer who was basically a physiotherapist. I mean, no disrespect to physiotherapists who do a fantastic job, but they didn't have a coach. Roy had also, because of his training as a PT instructor, Roy had also done a bit of coaching in the game. So before the third Test match in 1947, when he played against New Zealand, he coached the Great Britain squad in a couple of training sessions. And I think that people here can attest and know better than I can, because sadly I never met him. Roy was always an authority figure. He had a bearing, a charisma and authority about him that showed that he was a leader. And I think anybody who met him in those days would realise he's got the authority to lead a team, and he's also got the training and background from being a PT instructor and being a first-class athlete himself. So I think in public it probably looked like it was a risk, but I think Hull knew exactly what they were doing and thought this was the future. And because it was part of a rebuilding club, so they'd also signed, just before they signed Roy, they signed Tommy Harris, the great Welsh hooker. They'd signed Johnny Whiteley, who became Roy mentored Johnny and became, as Johnny said, like a second father to him, a father figure. And so Hull were conscious of rebuilding. I think Roy was the kind of the linchpin of that rebuilding process.
We've talked about how revolutionary he was and the techniques that he brought. Would it be fair to say that he was the first coach that took a holistic view of his players? That it wasn't just about tactics, but also the other half of that, and equally as important, was how much Reaney did that with the wives and the girlfriends, and so the club itself became the way that the players were best looked after, which led to great performances.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this is something that is still rare today in clubs, because Roy and his wife Reaney, who he'd married when he came to Wigan to play for Wigan in the 1930s, acted as a team, and Reaney felt that her role was to, if you like, be the manager of the players' wives and girlfriends, introduce them to the game, take them to the game, explain what the game is about for those who weren't familiar. She organised social events for them, organised coaches to matches. She really saw herself as complementary to Roy's duties as the first team coach. and between them, they really strive to create a family atmosphere. So certainly one of the things that Roy was very notable for at Hull was because he had a young team, he literally became a father figure to them and would give people advice on what to dress, what cars to buy, where to go on holiday and things like that. And there's a photo that I think is in the book where he's actually in one of the local gents outfitters in Hull with Johnny Whiteley and I think Tommy Harris, and he's obviously pointing out what shirts to buy and things like that. And so they treated him as a mentor. Also, I think that they, both Roy and Reaney, if players wanted, they acted as confidants. I know some players said when they had personal problems, they'd go to Roy and they'd get advice. They'd go and ask him, like a father or a mother or a parent. And they were very conscious about this, I think. They did it deliberately because they valued the family atmosphere. And I think also for Roy, it was to create an environment where he could fully relax. Because, clearly, as a black guy, there was always the risk when he went to a pub or a restaurant or hotels that there'd be some element of racism. Somebody might say something, or, as did happen, he'd be asked to leave hotels because of the colour of his skin. But within the club, he could create a world where that didn't exist. He didn't have to worry about that. Yeah, it was a big family. And one of the great examples of this, and I'm not sure that Brad Arthur would be up for this, when Roy went to North Sydney, Roy and Reaney volunteered to babysit for the players if they wanted to go out. So literally, players could go to Roy and say, look, me and the wife are thinking of going out somewhere on Thursday night, can you babysit for us? And normally they'd say yeah. And he'd organise barbecues on a Saturday for all the players and their families. And so a very, very conscious sense of developing a family atmosphere and a team atmosphere in a way that, certainly didn't happen then, and I would imagine almost never happens now because the game's much more professional as well. So, but yeah, I think that goes to how he envisaged not just how his team should be, but how life should be.
I think the nearest modern parallel at Headingley would be Graham Murray.
Yeah,
when he came for 2 years in exactly the same.
Yeah.
Just looking at the rugby side of things, because obviously you're as much a student of the game as you are the subject matter. While he was at Leeds, the rules changed from unlimited to initially 4 tackles. I think he was the only coach to adapt to that and see how best to make that work. And how much of that was he helped in by the fact that the predominant core of his squad were young and were hanging on his every word?
Oh, definitely. I mean, he's on record as saying when 4 tackles were introduced in 1966, that changed the way the game was played and made it more amenable to Roy Francis football. Because the thing about Roy was that he wanted to play, although I don't think he called it, it's like total rugby league where backs could tackle as hard as forwards and defend like forwards, but forwards could also run and pass the ball like backs. So that was always his goal. And once limited tackle football was brought in, it meant that the ball couldn't be killed by endless forward drives. You just keep recycling, which is what happened a lot in the 50s and 60s. And it immediately, basically you had to use the ball in the 4 tackles. Then it became 6 tackles in 71. But that meant that Roy's type of football was absolutely its element. And I think, as you said, combined with the fact they had a great crop of youngsters, who, all in the very early 20s, all of whom Roy could, for want of a better term, mould and shape into the type of players he wanted. So as soon as 6 tackles came in, then the team started on its upward trajectory. The players started to get mature. A lot of the players that he brought in to keep the team, to bring experience to the team, they started to retire, move on to other clubs. And so the team was, the great team that we can all remember. And they were perfect for limited tackle rugby league. In a way that I don't think, certainly in the early stages, no team really cottoned on to. And you can tell that because of the, better than I can, the fact that Leeds finished at the top of the table 4 out of 5 seasons after 67. So they just dominated. And I think that was part because great crop of players, great coach, but also because the game had changed in precisely the way Roy wanted it to.
I think for those of us that were privileged to get our rugby league education watching those teams. It was also the ability to strike anywhere on the field. That what Roy told his team was, I'm not really bothered whether you're playing in your own 22 or the opposition. If you see an opportunity, go for it.
Yeah.
You mentioned the experienced players there. He had a fantastic ability to add a player into the mix or change their position to bring the best out of the kids that he had and was bringing through. So to relate it to Leeds, obviously Beveridge will be one, Mick Clark, Bill Ramsey. How do you reckon he spotted these players and knew exactly what he needed to... I mean, in the case of Mick Clark, everybody said his game was finished, but he moved him up to prop. In the case of Bill Ramsey, he'd been out of the game for a year before he brought him to Leeds, he'd been injured. But all of these players went on to play a massive role in the success of Roy's teams.
Yeah, and I think also he was also the making of Bev Risman as a fullback, because Bevan originally played Union as a fly-half, and then played stand-off when he came to Lee. And he started playing fullback a bit at Lee, but I think it was Roy who really managed his conversion to become the great fullback that he was. I think also the other thing, it's interesting that both Bill Ramsey and Mick Clark started out as second rowers and Roy moved them forward. So it fits Roy's idea that you want mobile, all your folks should be mobile. All your folks should be able to run and pass in a way that, even in the 60s, not all rugby league forwards, there was still an element of props who would go from scrum to scrum, because there's still a lot more scrums in the game then. But it was Roy's pushing to have that active running pack that was one of the secrets of his success. I mean, like the fact that he insisted on all players using running spikes and doing sprint training. So the classic example at Hull, when he first brought spikes in for all the players, he gave some to Tommy Harris, who was quite big for a hooker in those days. Tommy Harris said, "What do I need these for? I'm a hooker." And Roy said, "Yeah, but you're going to be the fastest bloody hooker in the game once I've finished with you." So that was the kind of his philosophy. So I think if players had that experience, like great players like Mick Clark and Bill Ramsey, they could, once they'd lost a bit of that pace that put them in the second row, they could move up, but they still had the mentality of attacking football. And I think that was one of his great abilities, to figure out, be a bit ahead of the curve and figure out where players could fit in their declining years, so he could still make use of their experience without sacrificing anything in terms of the way the team played.
We're joined now by Ian. Thank you for coming. Roy's son, for those that haven't met him before. One of the words we've heard used about Roy tonight is charisma. How much did you realise when you were growing up that your dad was special and unique?
Well, I'm glad you asked me that, because as a young man, he was everything I wanted to be. He was a superb athlete. He was very funny. He was good to be around. He was a joker, but also he was very focused, and he got the job done. He was the font of knowledge for me. Anything I wanted, I used to go to him and ask him, and he had the answer for. So he was everything. He was just all rolled into one. He was everything to me.
We've heard a bit about his family background, some of which you may not even know until Tony wrote the book.
No.
Did he mention his upbringing at all, and the challenges that surrounded him as he grew up, the racism perhaps that he faced, his decision to come north, as it were, and the time he spent in Sydney doing interviews like that?
No, he was also very private, to the point of being almost secretive. We knew that he had a lot of problems from his colour, but he never discussed it with me or our kid, or he might have done with my mother, but I don't know. But one incident that sticks in my mind, we were planning a business, and we were all stood around a table, and we all had a blueprint. There was a blueprint on the table, and we all had our hands on, and we were pointing things out. And I saw him look at all our white hands and his brown hand, and he took his hand away. And the look on his face was one I'd never seen before. So something had happened, but I didn't really know what. But I knew it was significant to him. He was different, and he knew it. But he didn't want to talk about anything really, particularly to me or my brother. He just kept it to himself. In actual fact, that was his own doing because he had 2 nervous breakdowns later on. No, he was his own person in every single way. He was a one-off, complete one-off.
Did he ever talk about, or what do you think he thought of his achievements in the game? You know, the first black player to play for Great Britain in 1947, first black coach. He's got a place in sporting history that we may be recognising 50 years too late. Did he think he was something special?
No, not overtly. He wasn't a bragging sort of man. He knew what he was capable of, and he knew what he had to do or what he wanted to do. So he just carried it out. He never bragged about his achievements. He never spoke about them, particularly in a family situation when you're liable to do. But he just went on. He just did his own thing completely and entirely and utterly. He had superb confidence in himself and his ability, and he just went and did it. But he didn't want to talk about it particularly. He let his achievements speak for themselves.
You talk about his confidence, and another one of the aspects of the book that people won't know until they read it is the mental health issues that you've just hinted at. Again, it seemed to those of us at Leeds that had seen his fantastic career, came back for a season in 75, then went on to Bradford, that although we could see him sometimes in the businesses that he had, he almost disappeared, became a recluse after he stopped coaching Rugby League. Clearly his time at North Sydney affected him as well. He needed a little bit of space to get over that. How did that play out as a family?
It was sad really, because he had been feted and lauded and applauded, but when the applause had stopped and the lights had gone out, he used to sit in his flat, my mother's and his flat, and he always had his blazer. He was always smart. He was a very smart guy, and he had the blazer on. And he, when the phone went, I was there one day when the phone went, and he said to my mother, "If that's the Daily Mail, I'm not in." It never was the Daily Mail because his time had gone. But a story I'd like to tell you about, which is unique to the family, and not everybody knows about this, but it just illustrates him. He had 2 nervous breakdowns, one both in Beverley, and one was, my brother and I were walking up the street back to our business, and he was walking down, and we said, "Oh, there's my dad, hello Dad," and he looked right through us and just kept on walking, and we knew something was wrong, but we didn't quite know what. He got out of that, but the second one was a lot more serious, and it was so serious, my mother took him down to London to a psychiatric unit, and put him in there for treatment. And after a week, the guy who was treating him rang my mother and said, "I'm going to discharge him because he's just like an onion. You peel off one layer and there's another layer underneath." He said he started messing about with me. He's complex, he's highly intelligent, he's complicated, and I can do no more for him. So come and pick him up, I'm discharging him. So Mum went down to London, booked into a hotel for 2 nights, and they arranged to meet in the bar the following day, in the hotel bar, and then have some lunch. And when she walked into the bar, there was this elderly, there were other people in the bar, but this guy at the end of the bar, he had the full turban on, a heavy beard, and rings, and a beautiful white suit on, and he was flirting outrageously with my mother. And luckily, my mother didn't take him on, because when he came over to introduce himself, it was my dad. And he'd been to a theatrical costumier that morning and got kitted out with all the lot, makeup, turban, rings, the full thing. But that was the playful side of him. He was a lovely man. He wanted everybody to have fun, and he wanted to entertain. And he entertained people on the field, but he also entertained other people, the family particularly. He was a real joker. He was a lovely man.
We're extremely grateful for you being here, and it's given another layer of insight. Just as a last question, it would be fair to ask about this place, Headingley. I'm assuming that you used to come up and have a play here, watch the teams here, enjoy the rugby here. How much does this stadium mean to the Francis family?
Like Hull, it was a special place. Everything my father wanted. Bradford didn't really resonate with the family for some reason. But Wigan did. He was always very fond of Wigan. That was where his heart, where he left his heart. But he was very, very much, he loved this place. He loved it. As Tony's just said. The boys he was coaching and mentoring, they all meant a lot to him. I know Barry Seabone's here and Drew Broad and people like that. But everybody, my dad was, they were one big family, and he was very, very fond of it, very fond indeed. It was part of his life, and his life had so many parts. You know, he was fond of the North Sydney boys, but he went into everything 101%. But Leeds was special, very special too.
Thank you, Ian. I think you'll all agree. It's given us all an extra level of appreciation of the man which is behind the context of this book. I was only going to ask one more question to Tony before we throw it open to the floor, because obviously we want to give you time to buy the book. I think that you hinted at it with Johnny Whiteley, where you said that Roy became a second father to him, effectively. Influence over other men. How can we appreciate that it was a white man's world, that for a black man to become so important to white men, for the fact that Johnny Whiteley never forgot that, always mentioned that, always referred to that when he was asked about his own coaching career and his success as a player. Again, do you get the feeling now, having not met him and written this book, exactly what his influence was?
$64,000 question. I think a lot of it is, obviously he had a unique talent, as you can see from the interview. A huge amount of charisma, incredibly articulate, clearly a leader of men. And I think that, one of the, in a sense, there's a kind of, he succeeded in a way that his father never succeeded in Britain, and why he felt he had to go to America to try and fulfill his talents and his gifts. Roy found rugby, and that allowed him to develop to the fullest all the things that either he inherited from his father, or he'd learned from his mother, or he'd imbibed from the communities in which he grew up. And I think, again, to bank the Rugby League drum, that if he hadn't have switched to Rugby League when he was 17, if he'd stayed in Rugby Union, we'd have never have heard of him. Because at that point, no black players could be selected for the Welsh Rugby Union team. And you look back and there are no black players in Rugby Union at that point. So without Rugby League, Roy wouldn't have had a platform to achieve what he did. So I think it's a combination of environment, his upbringing, and the community that he found himself in. But also I think that he, in a sense, he embodied that to some extent. One of the things that Johnny Whiteley said, which is really how I end the book, is that, and I think other players said this, but not quite as directly as Johnny did. Johnny said, well, look, I should revert to my true Hull accent here. I'm just a kid from Ezel Road. If it hadn't been for Roy Francis, where would I have ended up? If he hadn't given me the opportunity to use my rugby talent, who knows where it would have been? And so I think Roy, in a lot of ways, was the embodiment of what Rugby League always viewed itself and hoped that it will be as a path to allow anybody, whatever their background, whatever their occupation, whatever the skill, whatever the colour of their skin, to achieve everything that their talents would allow. And I think that's his. He was both a beneficiary of that and also a proponent of that. And speaking to all the players that I spoke to, that was one of the things that he gave them. He gave them opportunity and the benefit of his experience to raise themselves up to a higher level than what they could have probably dreamt of before. I think that's the true measure of the man.
tonight, you've not only got an insight into watching the teams that Roy coached and enjoying them, but the man behind that. We've got probably, about 10 minutes. If anybody's got any questions, I'm sure Ian wouldn't mind answering any if you want to ask about the family. Has anybody got any questions? David?
I was lucky enough, I pre-ordered it, so I've been lucky enough to read a couple of chapters on it. And what got me when I was reading it, this question might seem a bit obvious, but what are the barriers in writing a book like this when a lot of people are here? And how do you get over that?
That's why it took me so long. I started in COVID. Well, the barriers, it's like, right, most ordinary people don't leave diaries behind, don't leave letters behind. It's not like you're writing the biography of somebody who's already famous, who's a politician or a novelist or something like that. So that's the first problem. It's lucky, I think, that Roy became so prominent as a coach in two cities, so there's a lot of coverage on it. So that helped. The other thing is I was very lucky that I think the first person I spoke to was Johnny Whiteley, who basically spent 6 hours telling me about his career with Roy and what Roy meant to him, and 6 hours that could have gone on for another 60. He was so interested. And then I met Roy's two sons and their wives, who I'm eternally grateful for, because they opened themselves to me and to the project in a way that that I had no right to expect. I've got to say, one of the things, this is the first biography I've ever read, and one of the reasons that I always hesitated was because I thought, well, what happens if the people who know the person I'm writing about don't like the project, or don't get on with me, or there's things that they don't want to be revealed. So I always felt it was a tricky thing, but the prospect of doing a book about Roy was just so much that I overcame that. And I have to say that Ian and Jean were absolutely fantastic in they were leaving, for me, no stone unturned. It's a book about a public man. It's about his public facing, what he did in public and how he made his contribution to the world. So it's really down to first of all to the family, but then also to players, a lot of whom are here tonight, Barry, John, and then wives like Janice, who's fantastic, Margaret, and so that was the thing that really unlocked the whole thing. That people wanted to talk about Roy. Everybody wanted to talk about Roy, and I have to say that I've spoken to about 200 people. Sadly, most of the whole team, I was too late. If I'd started 5 years earlier, it could be an even better book. And I never met anybody who had a bad word to say to him about Roy. Some people said, "Oh, I know somebody who didn't like or didn't follow them," but I never actually met them. So, so that was an advantage. But really, it's the family and the people who know who are so generous with their time and their spirit of openness.
So I guess the $64,000 question before we take another one from the floor is for Ian. How good's the book? Is it an accurate representation?
Yeah, you give me that. That's it. Right.
It's the end of my career now.
No, seriously, Tony. I said when you met me in the car park to bring me in here, I told you then, Jean and I have talked about it subsequently when having read the book, but having met you, you're a storyteller, and it was a story that needed telling, and it's been far too long being told, but you've done it so brilliantly, seriously. It's even I'm interested and I know what we're talking. So congratulations to you, definitely.
Any other questions?
What was his standing with the other coaches at the time? And who were the first coaches to take on board what he was describing as success?
Oh, that's a very interesting question. I'm not quite sure, to be honest, of what his standing was with other coaches. I think I didn't get much of a sense, Ian will know better, that he mixed a lot with other coaches. I know he knew Seth Thompson. Seth Thompson coached Barrow 59-60. I know he knew Seth. But then I think mainly his contribution was the production line of coaches of players who've been coached by him. So, Hull, Johnny White was most. Well, in fact, Colin Hunt was the first. Colin Hunt went to coach Rovers and coach Great Britain. Johnny succeeded at Hull, then went to coach Rovers and became coach of Great Britain twice. Tommy Harris coached at York for a long time. And then here, from Leeds, Barry had a long career at Bradford. Phil had a long career coaching.
Sid.
Sid Hines, obviously Sid was the guy who succeeded him in 75. So there's kind of a long, and Mick Clark ended up coaching as well. So there's a long chain of coaches that came from the Roy Francis School of Rugby League Science, as the Yorkshire Evening Post once called it. But yeah, it's a good question. I don't know about his relationship with the coaches. I tend to think he didn't have much to do with them. I think that's the way the game was. And also, the other point is that not every club had a coach in the same way, even in the 60s. But yeah, good point. I'll think about that for the second edition.
Phil, you got your
I
hand.
think to answer some of that question, I don't think it's a matter of what coaches took it on. I think other teams realised that when they played Leeds were fitter, stronger, faster.
Yeah.
And I think that changed the game completely.
Yeah.
I think that's how strong it was. It wasn't just one or two coaches taking it on. I think they realised if they wanted to compete, they had to start getting on board. And I think that's what Roy actually started, not necessarily just on players. I think he changed the whole game personally.
That's certainly true in Australia as well, because Jim Mills told me something that I didn't realise, I've not heard from anybody else, that when Roy was at North Sydney, he took Jim Mills over in 1970, and Jim stayed with Roy and Reedy in Sydney. And Jim said every Saturday Roy would get a call from Jack Gibson, who was then coaching East, who would pick his brains on what was going on, in the Rugby League season. Had he got any hints or tips for the team that East were playing next, or what did he learn from North's last opponent? So, in a sense, that what Phil's just said is absolutely right, because Jack Gibson, he was seen as the godfather of Australian rugby league coaching, obviously took a lot of the lessons that Roy took with him to Australia and implemented them, and built some great teams at East and North State Parramatta in the 80s.
I don't know if it's been mentioned yet, but Phil does have the highest try-scoring ratio of any player that's ever played for Leeds. Any other questions? Yes?
Not a question, an observation. I'm probably in a minority in that I saw Roy play 2 or 3 times. And I always disliked him because for 10-year-old he didn't like the opposing players. But I was struck even at that age. I couldn't understand why he had so much time to do everything that he did.
Yeah.
And then I realised in later life what good it was.
I mean, that's the thing. I mean, the other thing about Roy's playing career is that he was interrupted by World War II. He lost 6 years. I mean, he played for Eddie Waring's Dewsbury team, which won everything because Eddie Waring bought all the best players in the league to play for Dewsbury. And then he played for England Rugby Union Services team, which was effectively the England national team during the war, and was a massive success there. One of the top try scorers over the 3 years that he played for. So, the fact he could switch from 1 week to the next between top level rugby league and top level union shows what a great player he was.
Could I just say thank you to Ian? It's been a pleasure to meet you, and obviously for your contribution tonight.
Thank you.
Thank you.